The announcer's light had been on for a while, glowing softly behind the glass of the small studio window, the same way it did most nights when the town had gone quiet and the streets had grown still. Outside, the winter had gathered itself into the corners of the evening, settling over roofs and fences and bare trees, smoothing everything into a kind of hushed agreement. The station building sat just off the main road, not large, not new, and not especially remarkable in daylight, but at night it took on a steady, patient dignity. The front step had a dusting of salt tracked in and out by boots. The hallway smelled faintly of warm electronics and paper. In the control room, the meters glowed, their needles moving with the gentle certainty of work well understood. Somewhere a fan turned, and a small clock kept time in a modest, unshowy way. In the booth, a man sat at the microphone with a posture that belonged to years of quiet practice. He wore a cardigan that had softened with use, and his voice, when it came, never startled the room. It was the kind of voice that sounded like it had always existed in the late hours, tucked among the dial positions between distant stations and the faint whisper of static. On the desk beside him, there was a mug of coffee that had cooled and been reheated once already, and a stack of 45s in their sleeves, some with handwritten labels in tidy ink. There was a notebook too, not for grand plans but for simple reminders. The name of a sponsor, the time of a weather update, the title of a song that carried the right weight for an evening like this. The microphone had a small dent in its grill, and the desk had a spot where someone long ago had set down a cigarette and left a mark that never quite disappeared. It was a working place and a familiar place, and it belonged to the hour. The program moved along the way these programs did, with a quiet steadiness, as though the evening itself were being unwound on a spool. The man did not speak in a way that demanded attention. His words were a companionable current, and the music that followed fit into it naturally. On nights like this, the town listened in small, scattered pieces. In kitchens and living rooms, in bedrooms and dens, the radio sat on a table or a shelf, its dial light a faint ember. In a house out on the edge of town, a woman turned down the lamp by the sofa and left only the small light in the corner, the one with the shade that threw a warm circle on the wall. She had been folding laundry slowly, not because there was much of it, but because there was no reason to hurry. The shirts and towels had come out of the dryer warm, and she had let the warmth rise into her hands as she smoothed each one. The radio was on the counter, and it stayed at the same volume it always did at night, low enough to blend with the room, but clear enough to make the house feel occupied. The winter evening had a particular quality in that house. It began earlier than it did in summer, and it lingered. The windows were dark, reflecting the lights inside. The curtains hung in a familiar way, the same pattern repeating across the fabric. The heat moved quietly through the vents, and occasionally there was a soft click from the thermostat, no louder than a thought. In the kitchen, there was the smell of supper still faint in the air, something simple, something that had been cooked without ceremony and eaten without fuss. The table had been cleared, the dishes washed, and the dish towel hung back on its hook. The sink had been wiped down and the counter straightened. A kettle sat on the stove, not yet boiling, only waiting for the moment it would be needed. In the corner, a small calendar with a landscape photograph was pinned to the wall. The days had been crossed off in pencil. The month lay open like a promise that did not need to be rushed. In another part of town, in a modest brick house with a narrow front porch, an older man sat in an armchair with a newspaper folded neatly across his knees. He did not read it straight through. He glanced at a headline, then turned to a page he had read earlier, then back again, not because he was confused, but because the paper was part of the evening, a familiar object, something to handle and hold. The lamp beside him had a shade that turned the light a little golden, and on the end table there was a small dish that held a few coins and a set of keys. The radio, a sturdy wooden one with a cloth speaker and a dial with numbers that seemed to glow from within, sat on a small cabinet. Its sound filled the room gently. The man had his slippers on. His feet were warm, and the room was warm, and outside the cold could do whatever it liked. On the street beyond his window, the town seemed to have drawn in its breath. The sidewalks were empty. The branches of the trees were bare and dark against the sky. A street light at the corner made a pale circle on the snow that still clung to the curb, pushed into ridges by the plough days earlier. A car passed now and then, its tyres making a soft, steady sound on the pavement. The headlights moved across the walls of the living room for a moment, and then were gone. The man did not look up when it happened. It was only the evening, doing what it always did. Elsewhere, in a smaller house behind the grocery store, a young couple had finished washing dishes and were now sitting at the table with a deck of cards. They did not speak much. They had been together all day, and the silence between them was not empty. It was comfortable, like the warmth of the kitchen after the oven had been on. The radio played in the background, and the announcer's voice came and went between songs. The woman shuffled the cards slowly, and the man watched with a quiet patience. Outside, the back alley was quiet. The trash cans lined up against the fence, the snow packed down in footprints that had frozen hard. A stray cat moved along the edge of the alley, stopping now and then, its breath visible, then slipping into the darkness. The couple did not know the cat was there. The evening did not insist on being noticed. In a farmhouse outside town, the winter evening was wider, its quiet stretching farther. The house sat back from the road, and the fields around it were blank under a thin covering of snow. The wind had made small patterns across the surface, and the fence posts stood like markers in a calm, pale sea. Inside, the kitchen was the heart of the house. A man stood at the counter, slicing an apple with a small knife, the same way he had done many times. He placed the slices on a plate, then set the plate on the table. His wife poured tea from a pot that had been used for years, the handle worn smooth. A radio sat on the windowsill. It was not large, but it had a good sound, and it carried the station clearly. The announcer's voice reached them as though it had travelled over the cold fields and through the dark, arriving like a familiar visitor who did not need to be greeted with ceremony. The couple ate their apple slices slowly, each bite crisp and ordinary. The tea steamed in their cups. A dog lay on a rug by the stove, its body relaxed, its ears occasionally twitching. The only other sound was the soft movement of the house. The old boards expanded and contracted with the heat. Somewhere the furnace made a low, steady hum. The wind tapped lightly at the window, not insisting, only reminding the house that winter was present. The couple did not speak about the wind. They did not speak about much at all. They sat and listened, and the evening went on. Back in town, a woman in an apartment above the hardware store had turned on a small string of lights she kept around the window frame. They were not bright, and they did not flash. They simply glowed, adding a soft warmth to the glass. The apartment was small, but it was orderly. A crocheted throw lay folded on the end of the couch. A stack of magazines sat on the coffee table, arranged neatly. The woman had made a cup of cocoa and was holding it with both hands, letting the warmth seep in. The radio sat on the kitchen counter, and the station played a slow song, something that carried a gentle rhythm. The woman looked out the window at the empty street below, at the sign of the hardware store with its letters lit in a modest way. She watched a man lock the store's front door, pull his collar up against the cold and walk away. The streetlight made his shadow long on the snow. He disappeared into the dark, and the street returned to its quiet. Winter evenings had a way of making small things feel complete. The day's tasks once done stayed done. The dishes remained clean. The floors stayed swept. The curtains stayed drawn. The lights stayed on in their familiar places. There was nothing in the evening that demanded improvement. The house did not ask to be reorganized. The room did not ask for new furniture. The quiet did not ask to be filled. The winter evening, once it settled, simply stayed, holding the household in a steady, warm pocket against the cold outside. In the station booth, the announcer glanced at the clock and made a small mark in his notebook. He spoke again, not in a way that announced anything dramatic, but in the same calm tone that made the hour feel safe and familiar. He mentioned a sponsor in a simple sentence. He introduced a song without flourish. He did not raise his voice. He did not drop it to a whisper. He spoke as though he had spoken this way all his life, and perhaps he had. When the song began, he leaned back in his chair and listened for a moment, not because he needed to, but because he liked the way the music fit the night. Across town, the music found its way into a living room where a family had just finished a quiet game at the kitchen table. The father gathered the pieces, the mother stacked the cards, and the children, tired in that steady winter way, moved toward the hallway. There was no fuss. Pajamas had been laid out earlier. The bathroom light came on, then went off. The sound of water running briefly, then stopping, drifted through the house. The radio stayed in the living room, its sound soft and even. The mother turned down one lamp and left another on. She folded a blanket and placed it on the couch. She checked the lock on the front door, not because she feared anything, but because that was part of the routine. The father turned off the kitchen light. The house settled. In a nearby house, an elderly couple sat in the den with a small electric heater near their feet. The heater made a quiet fan sound, and its warmth rose gently. The couple had a record player on a cabinet, but tonight the radio was on instead. The man sat with a book open, though he did not read steadily. The woman had a basket of mending beside her chair, and she worked slowly, her needle moving in small, practiced motions. She did not hurry. She did not need to. The light from the lamp made a soft circle on her hands. The radio's sound filled the room in a way that did not demand anything. The couple did not talk about the news. They did not talk about plans. They were simply there, the way they had been there on many winter evenings, letting the time pass in a quiet, familiar way. Outside, the cold lay over the town, firm and patient. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp. The air had that winter quality that made sounds travel farther, though there were few sounds to carry. A train horn sounded in the distance, low and steady, and then faded. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then stopped. The town remained calm. The streetlights held their pale circles. The snow on the lawns reflected the light faintly. The night did not change. It did not need to. In one house, a man stood at the kitchen sink and washed a few remaining dishes, even though they could have waited. He liked the feeling of the warm water. He liked the simple motion of the sponge. He placed each dish in the rack and listened to the radio without thinking too much about the words. He dried his hands on a towel and turned off the faucet carefully. He checked the stove knobs and made sure everything was off. He looked out the window for a moment. The glass reflected his face back at him, and beyond it he could see only the dark yard and the faint outline of the fence. The porch light shone on the steps, making the snow look pale and clean. He turned away and went into the living room, where the lamp was on and the chair waited. In another house, a woman sat at a small writing desk near the window. She had a sheet of stationery in front of her and a pen in her hand. She was writing a letter. Not long, not urgent, just a simple note. She paused now and then to think, then wrote another sentence. The radio played softly behind her. The light from the desk lamp made the paper look warm and bright against the darker room. She addressed the letter carefully, her handwriting steady. When she finished, she folded the paper and slid it into an envelope. She did not seal it yet. She set it aside to do later, as though there was all the time in the world, which in a winter evening there often felt like there was. The station continued its gentle work. The announcer moved from song to song with the ease of someone who knew that the night did not need to be pushed. He did not fill every gap with talk. He let the music speak. He let silence exist for a beat when it happened naturally. He adjusted a knob slightly when needed. He watched the meters. He kept the hour steady. Outside the studio window, the parking lot was empty, except for his car and the car of the engineer in the back room. The engineer sat with headphones on, monitoring levels, making small notes. The back room had a coffee pot on a warmer, a stack of paper cups, and a bulletin board with notices pinned in neat rows. The building felt alive in a quiet way, like a ship moving through dark water. In the town's small diner, which stayed open later than most places, a waitress wiped down the counter with a cloth, her motions steady and practiced. Two men sat at the end of the counter with cups of coffee. They spoke quietly, their voices low. The radio in the kitchen was tuned to the same station, and the music drifted out through the pass-through window. The cook flipped a grilled cheese sandwich on the flat top, the smell of toasted bread and butter mixing with coffee and the faint scent of cleaning solution. The diner's neon sign glowed in the window, but outside the street was quiet. A car parked, a man came in, shook the snow from his hat, and sat in a booth. The waitress brought him coffee without being asked. The evening continued. Back in the houses, the winter routines were small and steady. Someone turned down the thermostat a degree. Someone pulled an extra blanket from the closet. Someone checked that the cat had water. Someone rinsed out a glass and set it in the rack. Someone turned the page of a book. Someone adjusted the lampshade slightly so the light fell better on the chair. Someone looked at the clock and then looked away, because the time did not matter much. The winter evening held these actions gently, letting them happen without emphasis. In a living room with a fireplace that was used more for comfort than necessity, a man added a log to the small fire. The flames rose briefly, then settled. The firelight moved across the walls in a slow, steady pattern. The radio played in the corner, its sound blending with the soft crackle of the wood. The man's wife sat on the couch with a knitting project in her lap. The needles clicked softly. The yarn moved through her fingers. She did not look up often. She did not need to. Her hands knew what to do. The man sat in his chair and sipped from a cup of tea. He watched the fire. The room was warm. The windows were dark. The evening was complete in its quiet way. Down the street, in a house where the children had already gone to bed, the parents sat at the kitchen table with a small lamp on. The overhead light was off. The lamp made the room feel smaller and cozier. They had a jigsaw puzzle spread out in front of them, pieces turned over, edges being found slowly. They did not rush. They spoke in short sentences, not about anything important, just small comments, a remembered name, a simple observation. The radio played softly in the living room, and the sound drifted into the kitchen like a distant companion. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The house held steady. Winter evenings often brought with them the same simple comforts, repeated without boredom. The warmth of a lamp, the sound of a familiar station, the quiet after dinner, the soft weight of a blanket, the steady heat in the vents, the muffled world outside. Even the small inconveniences of winter, the cold at the windows, the dry air, the need for an extra sweater, became part of the evening's texture, something expected and ordinary. People did not fight the winter. They lived alongside it. They let it be, and they filled their houses with soft light and familiar routines. On a side street near the school, a woman took a small pan of popcorn off the stove and poured it into a bowl. The popcorn was plain, only butter and salt, and the smell filled the kitchen quickly. She carried the bowl to the living room, where her husband sat with a magazine. They turned on the television, but the sound was low, and the radio in the kitchen still played softly, the announcer's voice occasionally slipping through the doorway. The woman sat down with the bowl between them. They ate slowly. The television flickered, showing a late-night movie that neither of them would follow closely. The winter evening did not require full attention. It allowed for drifting, for half-listening, for being present without effort. In the apartment above the bakery, the ovens had been turned off hours ago, but the building still held a faint warmth. A man who worked early mornings sat at his small table with a plate of toast and jam. He ate quietly, his eyes half on a book, half on nothing in particular. The radio was on. He listened to the familiar station because it made the apartment feel less empty. Outside his window, the bakery's sign was dark. The street lamp made the snow on the sidewalk glow softly. The man finished his toast, rinsed the plate, and set it in the sink. He did not wash it right away. He could do that later. He turned off the kitchen light and left the small lamp in the living room on. He sat back down and let the evening continue. The station's signal travelled farther than the town itself. It reached small houses on country roads, trailers parked near the river, cabins tucked behind stands of trees. In those places, winter evenings were even quieter. The darkness outside was deeper, the cold felt nearer. But inside, the same things happened. A lamp was turned on. A kettle was set on the stove. A chair was pulled closer to the heater. A radio played softly. The voice from the station filled the room with a calm, steady presence. It was not exciting. It did not need to be. It was simply there, like the glow of a lamp, like the steady hum of heat, like the winter evening itself. In one of those country houses, a woman sat at a small kitchen table sorting through a tin of buttons. The tin had been in the family for years. It held buttons of all shapes and sizes, some from coats long gone, some from shirts worn threadbare. The woman poured them gently onto a cloth and sorted them into small piles, not because she needed to, but because it was a quiet task that fit the evening. The radio played softly. The light above the table was warm. The house was still. The woman's hands moved slowly, and her mind stayed quiet. When she finished, she poured the buttons back into the tin and set it in the drawer. She wiped the cloth with her hand and folded it neatly. The evening continued. In town again, a man took out a box of old photographs and set them on the coffee table. He did not look through them all at once. He opened the box and lifted a few, holding them up to the lamplight. The pictures showed familiar faces, familiar places, summers and winters from years past. He did not feel a rush of emotion. He simply recognized things. He placed one photograph back, then another, then set the box aside. The radio played a slow song. The man leaned back and let the sound fill the room. The winter evening did not demand memories. It allowed them to appear quietly and then drift away. The night moved on, not quickly, but steadily. In the station, the announcer checked the weather report and spoke about it in a simple, even sentence. The temperature would drop a little. The roads would stay clear. There might be light snow later in the week. He did not dramatize it. He did not linger. He moved on to another song. The music played. The meters glowed. The clock ticked. Outside, the town remained quiet. In a house near the park, a woman stood at the window and watched the street for a moment. The park across the road was empty, its swings still, its benches covered with a dusting of snow. The streetlight made a soft sheen on the ice near the curb. The woman held a dish towel in her hands, twisting it gently, then smoothing it out. She turned away from the window and hung the towel back on its hook. She walked through the house, turning off lights that were no longer needed, leaving only the ones that made the rooms feel safe and warm. She left a lamp on in the living room and a small light in the hallway. She checked that the back door was locked. She turned the thermostat down slightly. Everything was done without hurry. Everything was part of the same familiar sequence. In a small bedroom, a child slept with a blanket pulled up to the chin. A nightlight glowed. Down the hall, the parents' voices were low, their movements soft. The radio in the living room continued to play. The winter evening held the house gently, keeping everything calm. Somewhere, a man in a workshop behind his house was putting away tools. He had been working on a small project, sanding a piece of wood, fitting a hinge, tightening a screw. The workshop was warm enough from a small heater. The radio played on a shelf, its sound mingling with the faint scrape of sandpaper. The man finished what he was doing and cleaned up carefully. He swept the floor. He turned off the heater. He turned off the overhead light and left the small radio on for a moment longer as he hung his jacket and pulled on his hat. When he stepped outside, the cold met him immediately, firm and quiet. He closed the workshop door behind him. He walked to the house, the snow crunching softly under his boots. Inside, the warmth welcomed him back. He took off his hat and hung it on the peg. The evening continued. In the station booth, the announcer leaned forward and spoke again, his voice steady, his words plain and familiar. He mentioned the name of the program. He did it the same way each night, not as a grand announcement, but as a simple marker, like turning down a lamp or setting a book aside. He let the music carry the rest. The song that followed had a slow tempo, the kind that sat easily in the air without drawing sharp edges. The night listened. Winter evenings were made of these small, ordinary moments, repeated without complaint and without demand. They were made of warm rooms and soft lights and familiar routines. They were made of simple tasks done slowly, not for achievement, but for the calm they brought. They were made of quiet companionship, whether shared in a room with someone else or felt through the steady presence of a radio on a shelf. They were made of the world outside kept at a distance, cold and dark and quiet, while inside the lamps glowed and the heat moved through vents and the clock kept time in an unhurried way. The evening did not reach a climax. It did not need to. It simply remained, steady and open-ended, as it had been, and as it would be again, with the soft light holding its place in the room, and the familiar routines carrying the night forward in the same calm, reliable manner. The hour was still early, but winter mornings did not always feel early in the same way other mornings did. The light came in slowly, not with a sudden change, but in small degrees, as if the day were taking its time to decide what kind of day it wanted to be. Outside, the cold stayed where it belonged, on the other side of the windows, quiet and steady. Inside, the house held a softer kind of weather, the mild warmth that lingered in rooms that had been lived in for a long time. The air had that winter smell that came from clean heat and still curtains, and yesterday's faint traces of supper gone from the kitchen. Nothing was in a hurry. The morning had already been going on for a while, in its own quiet way, even before anyone had said much of anything. In a modest house at the edge of a small town, the kitchen light was on, but only the smaller one, the one over the sink. It made a gentle pool of brightness that did not reach into the corners. The window above the sink showed only a dark yard and a pale strip of sky beginning to lift itself, but the glass also reflected the warm interior back into the room, and that reflection was sometimes the more comfortable sight. A dish towel hung neatly on its hook, and a coffee can sat on the counter beside a tin of sugar. The stove was clean, the burners cool, and the kettle waited on its usual spot as though it had been placed there by someone who had done it the same way for years. The refrigerator made its low hum, the kind that was not noticed until the house got quiet enough to hear it. Somewhere deeper in the house, the furnace cycled on with a soft, familiar sound. It was not loud, and it did not draw attention to itself. It simply worked, pushing warm air through vents and into rooms where the night's chill had tried, gently and without success, to settle. The warmth came in waves that were felt more than heard. The vents exhaled softly, and the house responded, in the way old houses did, with a faint creak here and there, boards shifting, a small settling of wood that sounded like a slow stretch after sleep. In the front room, a lamp glowed beside a chair. It was not the overhead light, not the bright kind meant for daytime. It was the lamp that made mornings feel gentle, the kind of lamp that stayed lit through winter mornings because winter mornings often liked a little help. The chair beside it was upholstered and slightly worn at the arms. A folded newspaper rested on the side table, and beside it a pair of reading glasses lay just where they had been left the night before. On the table there was also a small dish with a few coins and a set of keys, ordinary objects that belonged to the everyday life of the house and never had to be moved very far. In a bedroom down the hall, a man woke slowly, not all at once. He had the steady habit of someone who had done mornings for a long time. He did not sit up sharply. He shifted, pulled the blanket back a little, and listened for a moment to the house. The furnace was running. The refrigerator hummed. A distant floorboard gave a quiet creak, likely from someone already up. That sound was enough to let the day begin. He swung his feet down to the floor and found his slippers without looking. The floor was cool, but not too cold, and he stood there a moment in the half-light, letting himself become part of the morning in the same calm way the morning had become part of the house. He moved toward the bathroom with the slow, practiced steps of a winter morning, careful not to make noise that would feel like noise. The hall was dim, lit only by the small nightlight that stayed plugged into the outlet by the baseboard. The nightlight was shaped like a little lantern, and it cast a low glow across the carpet. The man did not think about it. It had been there so long it felt like part of the house itself. He passed it and went on, the house still quiet around him. In the kitchen, a woman stood at the sink, her hands in warm water, rinsing a mug that had been used late the night before. She wore a housecoat over her nightgown, and her hair was pinned loosely back. She moved calmly, not because she was trying to be calm, but because winter mornings asked for calm, and she answered in the only way that made sense. The radio sat on the counter by the window, its dial light faintly glowing. The volume was low. The sound was there the way a clock's ticking was there. A voice came through now and then between songs, steady and unhurried, like the kind of voice that knew how to fill the air without filling it too much. The woman set the mug upside down in the dish rack and reached for the coffee. The can made a soft metallic sound when she opened it. The smell rose gently, dry and familiar, the smell of mornings that had begun the same way for years. She scooped the grounds into the percolator basket, levelled them with the back of the spoon, and set the lid on with a small click. The percolator was an older one, not fancy, but reliable. It sat on the stove as though it belonged there by right. The woman filled it with water, set it on the burner, and turned the knob. The flame caught quietly, blue and steady. She did not watch it. She did not have to. She moved to the cupboard and took down 2 cups, placing them on the counter side by side, as if the morning were laying out its own simple order. Outside, the sky began to pale. The yard was still, the grass covered in a thin frost that made it look slightly brighter than it would later. The trees were bare, their branches dark lines against the lightening sky. A few birds sat in the branches, puffed up against the cold, unmoving, as if they too were waiting for the day to fully arrive. The street beyond the yard was quiet, with no cars passing yet, and the snow that had been pushed to the edges by ploughs remained in low ridges along the curb, hardened from repeated freezes. A street light at the corner still glowed, though its light was now faint against the growing daylight. It would go out soon, but for the moment it stayed on, patient and unhurried. The man came into the kitchen and paused at the doorway, taking in the scene without thinking much about it. The small light over the sink, the cups on the counter, the radio's soft sound, the familiar movements of the woman at the stove. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The woman glanced at him, offered a quiet, brief smile, and went back to what she was doing. The man moved to the table and sat down, pulling his chair out with a soft scrape that did not feel disruptive in the stillness. He folded his hands on the tabletop and looked toward the window, the way people did when the morning was still becoming itself. The percolator began to make its first small sounds, a faint gurgle deep inside, not quite coffee yet, but the promise of it. The woman took 2 slices of bread from a bread box and set them in the toaster. The toaster was a sturdy one, chrome and slightly dulled, and when she pressed the lever down it made a confident click. The bread sat quietly inside while the heating coils warmed. The woman opened the refrigerator and took out a small dish of butter. She set it on the table with a butter knife and a plate. Nothing about the morning felt like an occasion. It felt like a morning. It felt like winter, and it felt like home. In the front room, the lamp still glowed beside the chair, and the newspaper lay waiting. The man would read it later, not all at once, but in his usual slow way, glancing at a headline, then reading a section, then setting it down and letting the words settle. It was not a matter of information. It was a matter of routine. The newspaper belonged to winter mornings the way coffee did. It gave the hands something to hold and the mind something to rest against without demanding too much. Down the hall, a child shifted in bed, turning over, the blanket rising and falling. In the next room, another child slept with one arm thrown over the pillow, breathing evenly. The house held them quietly, letting them remain in sleep a little longer. There was no school bus yet, no rushed breakfast, no scramble for mittens. The morning was still in its earliest stage, the stage when even the day itself seemed to be moving gently. The toaster popped, the slices rising with a soft spring. The sound was small and familiar, not a jolt, simply a marker that the morning was continuing. The woman set the toast on plates, buttered it slowly, and placed the plates on the table. The man reached for one and nodded his thanks without speaking. The coffee began to perk in earnest now, the percolator's glass knob showing dark liquid cycling up and down in a steady rhythm. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and comforting. It was the kind of smell that made a room feel complete. The radio played a slow song, something smooth and familiar, and then the voice returned. It was a local voice, a late-night voice that had drifted into morning, the kind that stayed calm no matter the hour. It said a few words about the weather and the roads, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. It mentioned the temperature, the fact that the wind would be light, the fact that the sun might show itself later. The voice did not make it sound like news. It made it sound like part of the fabric of the day. The woman listened without focusing on every word. The man listened the same way. The children, sleeping down the hall, did not listen at all. But the radio's presence filled the house anyway, as gentle as the hum of the refrigerator. As the coffee finished, the woman turned off the burner and carried the percolator to the table. She poured carefully, the dark coffee steaming in the cups. The steam rose and disappeared, as if it had nowhere to go but into the quiet air of the kitchen. The man wrapped his hands around his cup and held it for a moment before taking a sip. The warmth moved into his hands, and it seemed to match the warmth moving through the vents. The woman sat down as well, got her own cup in front of her, and for a few minutes they ate and drank without saying much. The morning did not require conversation. It simply required presence. Outside, the sky grew brighter, though the sun itself was not yet visible. The yard remained still. The frost on the grass began to soften. The streetlight at the corner flickered and went out, its job done for now. A single car passed slowly, tires making a faint sound on the road. It was not loud, and it did not disturb the morning. It was simply a reminder that the world beyond the house was also waking, in its own slow winter way. After breakfast, the woman stood and rinsed the cups. She moved with the same calm rhythm she had used to make coffee. She wiped the counter with a cloth and set the plates in the sink. She did not wash everything immediately. There was time for that. The man carried his cup into the front room and set it on the side table by the chair. He picked up the newspaper and opened it, the paper making a soft rustle. The lamp beside him continued to glow, even though the daylight was stronger now, because winter mornings allowed for lamplight longer than other seasons did. The lamp made the room feel warmer, and the man liked that. The woman walked into the living room and adjusted the curtains slightly, not opening them fully, but moving them so that a little more light could come in. She did it with the care of someone who knew how to manage winter light, letting it in without letting the cold feel too close. She then went to the hallway and looked in on the children, not waking them, only checking. Their rooms were dim, the blankets pulled up, the air quiet. She stepped away again, leaving them to their sleep, and returned to the kitchen. In the kitchen, she began a small task that belonged to winter mornings. She took a bowl from the cupboard and a bag of flour from the pantry. The task was not complicated. It was something she did now and then, not because the house required it, but because it made the morning feel right. Perhaps she was mixing something for later, biscuits, or a simple batter for pancakes, or a batch of muffins to warm the kitchen further. The details mattered less than the motion itself, the quiet mixing, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl, the soft shift of flour as it settled. The radio continued on, steady and low, the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and the faint promise of baking, a smell that always belonged to winter mornings. In the front room, the man turned a page of the newspaper and read slowly. He did not linger on the heavier items. He skimmed them and moved on. He read the local notices, the weather report, the small items about town events, the kind of events that always seemed to be happening, but never in a way that disturbed the calm life of the place. He folded the paper and set it down, then picked it up again, then set it down once more. He sipped his coffee. He looked at the window, where the daylight now showed the yard clearly. The frost was mostly gone. The snow ridges by the curb remained, but they looked less harsh in the full light. The bare trees stood quietly. The world was still winter, but the day was now awake. In another house down the street, a similar morning was happening. The windows were fogged slightly at the edges. A kettle warmed on the stove. A man in a robe stood at the back door, looking out at the yard. He did not go outside. He only looked. The cold was not inviting, but the view was calm. A woman sat at the table with a small stack of mail, sorting it without hurry, placing bills in one pile, letters in another, a catalogue in a third. The radio played softly in that kitchen too, perhaps the same station, perhaps another, but the sound was similar, gentle and steady. Their house had its own routines, but they were not much different from the routines of the house at the edge of town. Winter mornings tended to shape households into similar patterns, quiet, warm, contained. In an apartment above the hardware store, a young man who worked the early shift was already awake. He sat at a small table with a bowl of oatmeal. The steam rose faintly, and he ate slowly. The apartment was small, but it was orderly. A coat hung on a hook by the door. A pair of boots sat on a tray to catch melting snow. A radio rested on the counter, playing quietly. The man finished his breakfast and rinsed his bowl, then stood for a moment by the window. The street below was beginning to move. a delivery truck rolling by, a man walking with his hands in his pockets. The young man did not feel rushed. He had time. He would put on his coat and go out soon enough. For now, he simply stood and watched the morning unfold. In the small-town diner, the winter morning had its own calm rhythm. The cook turned on the lights one by one. The coffee brewed in a large pot. The first waitress arrived and tied her apron, her movements practiced and unhurried. The booths were empty, but they would not be for long. The windows were dark at first, then gradually filled with pale light. Outside, the sidewalk was still quiet, and the neon sign in the window glowed softly, though it would be less noticeable as the day brightened. The radio in the kitchen played quietly, a companion to the clink of cups and the soft scrape of chairs being pulled into place. The diner, like the homes, was waking in a winter way, slowly, steadily, without fuss. Back in the house at the edge of town, the woman finished her quiet task in the kitchen and set the bowl aside. She wiped her hands on a towel and stood for a moment, listening. The house was still mostly quiet. The man in the front room turned another page of the paper. The radio played a song. The furnace hummed. The morning held itself steady. The woman moved to the sink and washed a few dishes, not all, only the ones that made the counter look neat. She placed them in the rack and dried her hands again. She then opened a drawer and took out a small notepad, writing down a few things in a simple list, though it was not a list that demanded action. It was simply a reminder of what might be done later: groceries, maybe a trip into town, perhaps a call to someone. The note stayed on the counter, and the morning did not change because of it. Down the hall, one of the children stirred and sat up slowly, hair tousled, eyes half open. The child padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep away in small motions, and stood near the table. The woman did not greet the child with excitement. She simply smiled and set out a small bowl. She poured cereal and added milk. The child ate quietly, the spoon moving slowly, the morning still gentle. The radio continued. The man in the front room remained at his paper. The second child would wake eventually, and then the house would become a little less quiet, but not suddenly. Winter mornings rarely changed suddenly. They shifted gradually, as the light shifted, as the heat cycled, as people moved from sleep to waking, one small step at a time. The daylight now had a little more colour. It was still pale, still winter, but it had moved beyond the grey-blue of the earliest hour. The sky was a lighter shade, and the windows no longer reflected the lamps as strongly. The yard looked ordinary, not dramatic, just a winter yard with bare branches and a fence line. The street had more activity now, a few more cars passing, a neighbour walking a dog, the dog's breath visible in the cold. The neighbour waved at no one in particular and continued down the sidewalk. The dog paused at a patch of snow, then moved on. These small movements were the town waking up, the day taking shape. In the kitchen, the woman refilled the man's coffee cup and her own. She checked the stove, turned off a burner that was no longer needed, and placed the kettle back in its usual position. She straightened the sugar tin and the coffee can. These were small acts of order that made the kitchen feel calm. The child finished cereal and left the bowl in the sink. The woman rinsed it and set it in the rack. Nothing felt burdensome. The morning was still in its quiet phase, where tasks did not pile up. They appeared and were handled, one at a time, without drama. In the front room, the man folded the newspaper and set it aside. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the radio more clearly now that the rustle of paper had stopped. The announcer's voice came in between songs, steady and plain, mentioning a local sponsor, mentioning the weather again, mentioning a song title that sounded familiar. The man did not need to know the details. The sound itself was enough. It filled the room the way the lamp light did, soft and reassuring, part of the fabric of the morning. The woman moved through the house, turning off a couple of lights now that daylight was stronger. She left the lamp in the front room on because it still felt right, but she turned off the small light over the sink, letting the morning light take its place. The house looked slightly different without that pool of brightness, but it still looked like itself. The woman paused at the window and looked out again. The frost was gone now. The yard was simply cold and quiet. The road was clear. The snow ridges remained. The day would go on. It would do what days did. But the winter morning, that slow, steady part of the day, had been given its proper time. It had been allowed to unfold without hurry, with warm coffee and soft light and familiar routines, with the radio's calm presence and the house's steady warmth. In the kitchen, the second child finally appeared, moving slowly, not fully awake yet. The woman set out another bowl, another spoon, another simple breakfast. The child ate quietly. The man in the front room stood and stretched, then walked to the kitchen, where he rested his hand on the back of the woman's chair for a moment. It was a small gesture, ordinary, not dramatic. He poured himself a little more coffee. He looked at the clock, then looked away. The time was not important. The morning was still the morning. Outside, the town continued to wake in its gentle winter way. The school buses would run soon, the shops would open, the diner would fill a little, the hardware store would unlock its door. The mail truck would make its rounds. But none of that had to happen all at once. The winter morning was not concerned with speed. It was concerned with steadiness. It was concerned with warmth held inside while cold stayed outside. It was concerned with small tasks done quietly. It was concerned with light that arrived slowly and stayed soft. It was concerned with the familiar feeling of home at the beginning of the day, when the house still held the night's calm and the day had not yet asked for much. The radio played on, the same steady station, the same calm voice, the same soft music drifting through kitchens and front rooms. In homes across town, coffee was poured, toast was buttered, newspapers were opened, curtains were adjusted, small lights were turned off or left on depending on what felt right. Winter mornings made their own kind of order, an order that did not need to be spoken aloud. The morning continued, open-ended and low stakes, with nothing urgent and nothing sharp, only the quiet movement of ordinary life as the day slowly became itself. The snow had been coming down for a while, not in a way that demanded notice, but in the steady, patient way it sometimes chose on winter days, as if it had all the time it needed. It did not arrive with gusts or sudden changes. It simply kept going, fine flakes drifting from a pale sky and settling wherever they landed. The town moved under it quietly, buildings and sidewalks and parked cars slowly taking on a softer outline, edges blurring as the snow gathered. Even the sound of the world seemed to change as it fell, as if the air itself were being wrapped in a thicker layer, something that held noises close and made them smaller. The streets did not become silent, but they became hushed, and the difference was felt more than it was noticed. In the late hours, the radio station kept its steady work, the signal moving out across the county the way it always did. Inside the studio, the lights were low and the equipment glowed softly. The host spoke in a voice that fit the hour, unhurried and plain-spoken, the kind of voice that did not press itself forward. The station's small building sat on a side street near the edge of town, and outside its windows the snow fell into the parking lot and onto the steps, collecting in thin layers. The streetlight near the corner shone down through the flakes, making them look brighter for a moment as they passed through the light, then letting them disappear into the dark again. The host did not need to mention the snow for it to be present. It was present in the way the night sounded, in the way the town moved, and in the way people stayed indoors with their lamps and their quiet routines. In a small house not far from the station, the snow could be seen through the living room window, falling steadily past the glass. The porch light made the flakes visible, and they drifted down in slow lines, some catching the light, some disappearing into the dark. Inside, the living room lamp was on, the kind with a shade that turned the light warm and soft. The curtains were drawn most of the way, but not completely. There was comfort in seeing the snow fall, in watching it without needing to go out into it. A man sat in a chair with a book open, though he did not read every word. He held the book as part of the evening, the way someone held a newspaper in the morning. The radio sat on a small table nearby, its dial glowing faintly. The sound filled the room without being loud, and the man let it blend with the quiet. In the kitchen, a woman rinsed a few dishes in warm water. She had already washed most of them earlier, but there were always a few that appeared later, a glass that had been used, a plate that had held a slice of bread, a spoon that had been left on the counter. She moved calmly, turning on the faucet, rinsing, setting things in the rack, wiping the counter with a cloth. The kitchen light was not bright. It was a small light over the sink, enough to see by, enough to make the room feel occupied. Outside the kitchen window, the snow fell, and the yard looked dim and softened. The fence line was still visible, but it looked gentler. The branches of the trees were dark against the pale sky, and the snow gathered on them in small amounts, not heavy, just enough to change their appearance slightly. The woman turned off the faucet and dried her hands, then stood for a moment and looked out the window. She did not stand there with any special thought. She simply stood and watched, letting the snow be part of the evening. In another part of town, the diner's windows glowed warm against the snowfall. The neon sign in the window was still lit, though the snow outside made its light look softer. Inside, the diner was not crowded. A couple sat in a booth near the window, coats draped over the seat beside them, coffee cups on the table. The cook moved behind the counter, wiping down a section of the grill. A waitress refilled cups and wiped her hands on her apron. The radio in the kitchen played softly, and the host's voice drifted out between songs, mingling with the low sounds of the diner. Outside, the snow gathered on the hoods of parked cars and along the edges of the sidewalk. A man came in, shook the snow from his hat, and sat at the counter. He ordered something simple and waited quietly, watching the snow through the window the way others did, not because it was exciting, but because it was steady and calm. On a residential street, a line of houses sat behind snow-covered lawns. The snowfall made the streetlights look hazier. The light did not reach as far, and the falling flakes made a soft curtain in the air. A car passed slowly, its tires making a quiet sound on the road, not the sharp sound of dry pavement, but a softer sound, almost muted. The headlights cut through the falling snow and then moved on, leaving the street as it was before, quiet and still. The snow continued without pause, and the street returned to its gentle hush. In one of those houses, a family had finished dinner earlier, and the table was cleared. The children were in their rooms, not yet asleep but quiet, reading or drawing. The parents sat in the living room with a game spread out on the coffee table, not a loud game, something simple. A lamp glowed. A small bowl of popcorn sat between them. The television was off. The radio played softly from the kitchen. Outside the window, the snow fell, and the porch light made the flakes visible. Now and then, the wind shifted slightly and the flakes drifted at a different angle, but even that movement was gentle. The family did not talk much. They did not need to. The evening was filled with small sounds, the soft click of a game piece, the rustle of paper, the quiet movement of someone shifting on the couch. The snow outside seemed to absorb everything, making the world feel smaller and safer. In a small apartment above a storefront, a man sat at a table with a cup of tea. The apartment was modest, with a small kitchen and a narrow living area, but it was warm. A radiator clicked softly now and then. The man looked out the window at the street below, where the snow fell in the light of a street lamp. The cars parked along the curb were beginning to take on a thin layer. The sidewalk looked pale and clean where the snow had not yet been stepped on. The man held his tea with both hands, letting the warmth move into his fingers. The radio was on low, and the host's voice came through steadily. The man did not think of the host as a person in a studio. He thought of the voice as part of the night, part of the town's quiet rhythm, like the soft sound of the radiator and the sight of snow falling past the window. In the station, the host turned a knob slightly and introduced another song. The music that followed was slow and steady. The host leaned back for a moment and looked through the studio window into the control room, where the engineer sat with headphones on. The engineer nodded, then looked back at the meters, making sure everything stayed even. The snow outside continued to fall. The station's parking lot was empty except for 2 cars. The host's car sat under the streetlight, and the snow was gathering on its roof. The windshield looked slightly frosted at the edges. The host did not worry about it. The car would be brushed off later. For now, the host stayed inside, where the warmth was steady and the work was simple. The snowfall had its own way of changing familiar places without changing them too much. The town was the same town, the houses the same houses, the streets the same streets. But the snow softened everything, making the outlines gentler, making the colours quieter. The brick of buildings looked darker against the white. The bare branches looked sharper against the pale sky. The streetlights looked warmer. Even the sounds of the town changed as if the snow absorbed them. A door closing sounded smaller. A car passing sounded farther away. A dog barking sounded muffled. The world did not become silent, but it became quiet in a different way. In a house out on a country road, the snow fell across fields that were already pale from earlier storms. The wind had made small patterns in the snow, ripples across the surface, and the new snow settled on top, smoothing some of those patterns away. The farmhouse sat back from the road, lights glowing in the windows. Inside, a couple sat at the kitchen table. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, not because it needed to, but because it made the house feel warmer. The couple ate slowly, talking only now and then. The radio was on the windowsill, and the host's voice reached them clearly. Outside, the snow fell steadily, and the darkness beyond the porch light was deep and calm. The couple did not need to go anywhere. The snow made sure of that. The evening belonged to the house and the warmth inside it. After supper, the woman in that farmhouse washed the dishes and set them in the rack. The man wiped the table with a cloth and then stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the snow. The porch light lit a small circle of falling flakes. Beyond that, the yard disappeared into darkness. The man could see the outline of the barn and the fence posts, but everything looked softened by the snow. He did not stay at the window long. He did not need to. He turned away and walked into the living room, where the lamp was on and the chair waited. The dog lay on a rug, its body relaxed. The radio played quietly. The house held steady. Back in town, the snow continued to fall in the late hours. The ploughs would not come until later, if they came at all tonight. The streets would remain covered in a thin layer, not dangerous, just quiet. The footprints on sidewalks would fill in slowly. The cars parked along the curb would become softer shapes. The town's familiar edges would blur. The streetlights would continue to glow through the falling flakes, making a gentle haze in the air. The snowfall did not feel like an event. It felt like a condition, a kind of weather that simply belonged to winter and to nights like this. In one house, a woman folded blankets in the living room, stacking them neatly in a basket. She did it slowly, smoothing each one, folding it into a tidy shape. She did not rush. The radio played softly in the kitchen. The snow fell outside the window, and the porch light made it visible. The woman glanced out now and then, not because she was checking anything, but because the sight of snowfall was calming in its steadiness. The blankets in the basket looked inviting, soft and warm. She carried the basket to the hallway closet and placed it on the shelf, then returned to the living room and sat down. She picked up a magazine and turned a page slowly. The lamp's light fell on the paper. The room was warm. The snow outside continued to fall. In another home, a man sat at a small desk near the window, writing a letter. The paper was plain, the handwriting steady. He did not write a long letter. He wrote a few paragraphs, simple news, nothing urgent. He paused now and then to think, then wrote another sentence. The radio played softly from the other room. Outside the window, the snow fell past the street lamp. The man finished the letter and folded it, placing it in an envelope. He did not seal it yet. He set it aside on the desk. The task was done, quietly, without fuss. The evening continued. At the diner, the last customers finished their meals. The waitress wiped down tables. The cook turned off one of the grill burners. The radio in the kitchen played on, the host's voice steady. Outside, the snow had gathered along the edges of the windows and on the steps. The neon sign still glowed, but its light looked softer through the falling snow. A car pulled away slowly, taillights fading into the white haze. The diner remained warm and lit for a little while longer. Then it too would close, its lights turned off one by one, leaving the street quieter still. In the station booth, the host spoke again, mentioning the weather in a simple sentence. He did not sound impressed by the snowfall, and he did not sound concerned. He sounded as though snowfall in winter was expected, as though it was part of the natural order of things. He introduced another song. The music began. The host looked at his notes, then set them down. He sipped from his coffee cup, which had been warmed more than once. The control room's meters glowed. The snow fell outside. The town listened. In the home, small evening routines continued. Someone turned down the thermostat a degree. Someone checked the lock on the back door. Someone rinsed a cup and set it in the rack. Someone folded a newspaper and set it aside. Someone turned off a light in a room that was no longer being used. Someone left a lamp on in the living room because it made the house feel safe and warm. The snow outside made the night feel enclosed, as though the town had been tucked under a blanket. The roads were quieter. The sounds were smaller. The world seemed softer. In a house near the school, a mother looked in on her children before going to bed. The hallway light was low. The bedrooms were dim. The children slept under blankets, their breathing steady. The mother adjusted a blanket slightly, then stepped back. She returned to the living room, where her husband sat with a book. The lamp was on. The radio played softly. The snow fell outside, visible in the porch light. The husband looked up briefly, then back down at his book. The mother sat down on the couch and picked up her knitting. Her needles clicked softly. The house remained calm. Across town, in a smaller house where an older couple lived, the snow falling outside was not new. They had seen many winters. They sat in their den with a small heater near their feet, though the main heat was on as well. The heater's fan made a quiet sound. The woman mended a shirt, needle moving slowly. The man listened to the radio and looked at a magazine. They did not talk much. They did not need to. The snow outside made the night feel even quieter than usual, and the quiet suited them. The lamplight warmed the room. The radio's voice filled the space gently. The snowfall continued. The snow did not fall with any announcement, it simply fell. It fell past porch lights and street lights. It fell onto sidewalks and rooftops. It fell onto parked cars and fences. It settled on tree branches and telephone wires in small amounts. It softened the sharp edges of the town. It made the sounds quieter. It made the night feel wrapped and contained. People moved through their homes in the usual ways, but perhaps a little more slowly. There was no need to go out. There was no need to do much of anything beyond what the evening already asked. The snowfall made it easier to stay in, easier to keep the lamps on, easier to let the radio play and let the time pass. On a residential street, a man stepped onto his porch for a moment. He wore a coat over his pajamas and slippers on his feet. He did not go far. He stood under the porch light and watched the snow fall. The flakes landed on his sleeves and melted. The air was cold and clean. The street was quiet. The light from the street lamp made the snow look bright as it fell. The man took a slow breath and then stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him. The warmth of the house greeted him immediately. He took off his coat and hung it on a hook. He walked into the living room, where the lamp was on and the radio played softly. He sat down again. The evening continued. In an apartment building near the center of town, a woman on the second floor looked out her window at the snowfall. She could see the tops of cars and the sidewalk below. The snow made the street look clean and pale. A man in a hat walked along the sidewalk, his shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. His footsteps were quiet on the snow. He crossed the street and disappeared behind a building. The woman watched for a moment, then turned away and went back to her kitchen. She stirred a pot of cocoa on the stove. The radio played softly. The kitchen was warm. The snow outside continued, steady and patient. The host at the radio station kept the program moving in the same calm way. He spoke between songs, not with excitement, but with a gentle steadiness. He mentioned a sponsor. He mentioned the time. He mentioned the weather again, not because it was urgent, but because it was part of the night. The snow outside did not stop. It continued to fall in the glow of the streetlight, filling the air with a soft curtain. The town's sounds remained muffled. The night remained calm. In a house on the edge of town, a couple sat at their kitchen table working on a jigsaw puzzle. The overhead light was off. A small lamp sat near the table, casting warm light on the pieces. The puzzle was a simple one, a picture of a landscape, perhaps a river or a country road. The couple worked slowly, finding edge pieces, fitting them together without hurry. The radio played softly in the next room. Outside, the snow fell, and the window showed only a dim yard and the soft glow of the porch light. The couple did not speak much. They did not need to. The puzzle pieces clicked together quietly. The evening moved on. In another home, a man sat in a chair with his feet up, a blanket over his legs. The blanket was thick and warm. He held a cup of tea. The radio played softly. Outside, the snow fell, and the porch light made it visible. The man watched the snow fall for a while, then looked away. He did not need to watch continuously. The snow was steady. It would still be falling when he looked again. He took a sip of tea. The room was warm. The lamplight was soft. The night remained as it was. The snowfall continued to do what snowfall did. It covered the tracks of earlier movement. It softened footprints on sidewalks. It made the edges of driveways less distinct. It settled on mailboxes and porch rails. It drifted onto shrubs and fences. It made the town look like itself, but quieter, gentler. The world did not become new. It became softened. And in that softness, the evening routines felt even more fitting, even more natural, as though the town and its people had been given permission to move slowly and keep things simple. In the station, the host leaned toward the microphone and spoke again. His voice was the same steady voice it had been all night. He did not try to paint dramatic pictures. He spoke plainly. He mentioned the snow in a sentence that sounded like something everyone already knew. He introduced a song that had a slow rhythm, and the music filled the air. The host sat back and listened. The engineer watched the meters. The snow fell outside. The parking lot grew whiter. The street beyond the station stayed quiet. In the homes, lamps remained on. Curtains stayed drawn. Coffee cups and tea mugs sat on tables. Plates were rinsed and left in racks. Books lay open or closed. Magazines rested on armchairs. People moved in slow, ordinary ways. They checked the windows and saw the snowfall. They returned to their chairs. They listened to the radio. They let the time pass. The snow continued, steady and patient, and the muffled quiet it brought stayed with the town, holding everything gently, keeping the night calm and familiar as it carried on without needing to arrive anywhere in particular.